The day Aaron Fletcher rode into Caldwell, Kansas, he owned exactly three things in this world: a chestnut mare named Rosie, a faded blue work shirt with a missing button at the collar, and a quiet kind of hope he had never quite been able to put down no matter how many times life had told him he should. It was the summer of 1878, and Caldwell sat on the southern edge of Kansas like a man perched on the edge of his seat, waiting for something to happen. The cattle trails ran through it like veins, and the cowboys who moved the longhorns north from Texas wore the dust of the Kisham Trail on their faces like a second skin. The town had two saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, a livery, a small church that leaned slightly to the left as though it had once been struck by something, and a rooming house run by a woman named Mrs. Hadley who charged 40 cents a night and included a biscuit with every morning. Aaron had been riding for 3 days straight when he came down the main road of Caldwell. His boots were cracked at the toe, his hat brim was stained dark with sweat, and the single shirt on his back had been washed in creek water so many times it was more memory than fabric. He was 26 years old, long in the leg, broad across the shoulder, with dark hair that fell past his ears and eyes the color of a winter sky just before snow, pale gray with something serious living behind them. He had come from Wichita, where he had spent 2 years working a cattle spread owned by a man named Gerald Booth who paid decent wages and said very little, which suited Aaron just fine. Before Wichita, he had been in Abilene. Before that, Dodge City. He was a man who moved not because he was running from something, but because he had not yet found whatever it was he was looking for, and somehow he had always believed the looking itself was the thing that kept a man decent. He tied Rosie to the post outside the general store and went in for grain and a sack of dried beans. The store smelled of leather and tobacco and sawdust, and behind the counter stood a girl, no, a woman, he corrected himself, who was arguing quietly but with great precision with an older man about the price of calico fabric. "The bolt has gone up 2 cents per yard since last month," the man behind the counter was saying. He was thick-necked and had a mustache that he clearly thought more of than the situation warranted. "Mr. Tibbs," the woman said, her voice steady, and even in the way of someone who had been steady and even through considerably worse things than a 2-cent price increase. "I was told 22 cents when I came in on Tuesday. I ordered accordingly. I have the money for 22 cents per yard, and that is what I came to pay." She was perhaps 23, with dark auburn hair pinned up loosely at the back of her neck, a few strands escaping to curl at her temples in the heat. She wore a plain gray dress with a white collar, and she held a small leather purse in both hands in front of her like she was protecting it. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they were fixed on Mr. Tibbs with the kind of calm certainty that made the older man shift uncomfortably behind his counter. Aaron stood near the door and did not move. He was not entirely sure why. He told himself he was waiting until the business was concluded. That was the polite thing, but really he was simply unable to look away from her. "Prices change," Mr. Tibbs said with the satisfaction of a man who knows he has the advantage. "Your word does not," she said, "and you gave it." There was a long pause. Mr. Tibbs looked at her. She looked back. She did not blink. "Fine," Mr. Tibbs said at last, clearly irritated. 22. "Thank you kindly," she said, and she smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that arrived quietly and then stayed and lit up the whole room from the inside. She counted out her coins, tucked her calico under her arm, and turned to leave. She nearly walked directly into Aaron, who had not stepped out of the way because he had still not entirely remembered that he was standing in a doorway. "Pardon me," she said, stepping to the side. "My fault," he said, stepping to the same side. They both stopped. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. Her brown eyes were flecked with something that might have been amber in the right light, and she had a small scar near her left eyebrow that he noticed and did not ask about because he had manners, even if he had only one shirt. "After you," he said, stepping aside properly this time. "Thank you," she said, and walked past him and out into the white summer glare of the Caldwell afternoon. Aaron stood for a moment in the store, then remembered he was there for grain and dried beans. He purchased these from Mr. Tibbs, who had regained enough of his dignity to be unhelpful about directions to the livery. He found the livery on his own. He did not see the woman again that day or the next. He spent those days doing what men like him did when they arrived in a cattle town in the summer of 1878. He asked about work. He went to every spread within reasonable riding distance of Caldwell. He was not a boastful man, but he knew cattle, knew horses, knew how to work from before the sun was up until long after it was down, and he had enough references from Gerald Booth in Wichita to satisfy any reasonable ranch foreman. On his third day in Caldwell, he got himself hired on at the Harlan Spread, 8 miles south of town, owned by a man named Douglas Harlan who was 60 years old and built like a fence post that had been through several storms and survived all of them. Harlan paid $12 a month, which was fair, and provided bunk and meals, which made it better than fair. Aaron shook the man's hand and rode Rosie out to the ranch the following morning. The Harlan Spread ran about 400 head of longhorns and employed 6 regular hands besides Aaron. There was a Mexican vaquero named Ernesto who had been working the Texas cattle trails since before Aaron was born and who knew more about horses than anyone Aaron had ever met. There were 2 brothers from Missouri named Cal and Pete Dunmore who were loud and cheerful and generally agreeable. There was a quiet Cherokee man named Sam Whitehorse who kept to himself most of the time but who, Aaron came to learn, had been working for Harlan for nearly 8 years and was the most trusted man on the whole property. There was a young hand barely past 18 named Billy Fields who reminded Aaron of himself at that age, all long limbs and serious eyes, and trying hard not to let anyone see how much everything meant to him. And there was Harlan's widower status, which filled the whole ranch with a particular quiet sadness that had settled into the wood of the house itself, into the curtains that had not been changed in years, into the table set every morning with 1 cup instead of 2. Harlan's wife, Nora, had died 3 years ago of the fever. Aaron did not learn this directly from Harlan, who did not speak of personal things. He learned it from Ernesto on the second evening when they were sitting outside the bunkhouse watching the last of the sun go behind the flat Kansas horizon. "He is a good man," Ernesto said. "Harder since she went, but good underneath the hard." "Most men are," Aaron said. Ernesto looked at him sideways. "Where you heading, Fletcher?" "Man like you does not stop for $12 a month unless he is either broke or looking for something." Aaron considered this. "Broke," he said. Ernesto smiled into his coffee. "Sure." On the second Saturday after arriving at the ranch, Harlan sent all his hands into town for supplies. It was a monthly thing, a chance for the men to clean up and get into Caldwell for a few hours before the following week's work began. Aaron rode in with Cal and Pete Dunmore, who spent the first 20 minutes of the journey arguing about whether a man named Pryor back in Missouri owed Cal $4 or $3, and then the next 20 minutes singing the same 3 verses of a hymn neither of them fully knew. Aaron was glad to be riding into town. He was not expecting to see her again so soon, and certainly not under the circumstances in which he did see her. He came around the corner of the general store onto the side street that ran behind it toward Mrs. Hadley's rooming house, and he found Irene Slater standing very still with a large, unhappy-looking man planted directly in front of her, blocking her path. The man was broad-chested with a reddish beard, and a smell about him that suggested the afternoon had not been his first visit to one of Caldwell's saloons. "I said I am not interested," Irene was saying in the same calm, even voice Aaron had heard her use on Mr. Tibbs, but there was something tighter in it now, something careful. "Aw, come on now," the man was saying, reaching out to take hold of her arm. "Do not touch me," she said. "I am just being friendly," he said, and his hand closed around her elbow. Aaron was off Rosie before he had made any conscious decision about it. He had walked 3 steps and was standing at the woman's left side before the man with the reddish beard had processed that anyone new was in the conversation. "Afternoon," Aaron said to the man, pleasantly but with absolutely no warmth in his eyes. The man looked at him. Mind your own business. She said she is not interested, Aaron said. And she said do not touch her. I think those are both clear enough. The man held Aaron's gaze for a moment, calculating. Aaron did not calculate. He simply stood there, very still, very present, like a wall that had always been there and was not going anywhere. The man released Irene's arm. He said something under his breath that was unpleasant, and he walked away back toward the saloon. Aaron turned to her. You all right? She rubbed her elbow briefly, then stopped, as though she had decided not to let him see that it had hurt. Yes, thank you. Aaron Fletcher, he said. I work out at the Harlan Spread. Irene Slater, she said. I live on the north edge of town. My father owns a small farm there. She looked at him with those dark, amber-flecked eyes, assessing him in the same steady way she had assessed Mr. Tibbs, and Aaron had the distinct feeling of being looked at properly for the first time in a long while. Not at his clothes or his horse or what work he could do, but at him, as though she was reading something he had not written down anywhere. You were in the general store last week, she said. I was, he said. The Tuesday argument, something softened in her expression. He had given me his word. He had, Aaron agreed. And you were right. She looked at him another moment. Then carefully she smiled. Not the full brightness of that first smile in the store, but something smaller and more private, and somehow that made it more significant. Good afternoon, Mr. Fletcher, she said, and continued on her way. Aaron stood on the side street for a moment, holding Rosie's reins, watching her go. He did not call after her. He did not need to. He had a very specific and not entirely comfortable feeling in his chest, the kind a man gets when something important has just started and he knows it, even if he cannot name it yet. The town of Caldwell in the summer of 1878 was alive in the way that only cattle towns could be alive, rough and bright and loud with commerce and danger, with the sound of cattle lowing and boots on board sidewalks, and the distant, constant melody of someone playing a piano in one of the saloons. The Kishom Trail had been bringing longhorns through since the early 1870s, and the town had grown up around it the way towns grew up around water, quickly and without much planning. The next time Aaron saw Irene was the following Saturday, at the Caldwell Methodist Church. This surprised him. He was not certain why he had come to church that morning, except that he had woken up before the other hands and found himself thinking about her calm, precise voice saying, I was told 22 cents when I came in on Tuesday. And that had led somehow to thinking about Sunday services back in Ohio, where he had grown up. And before he had fully worked through the logic of it, he was dressed, and on Rosie heading toward the church that leaned slightly to the left. She was sitting 3 rows from the front with a man who could only have been her father. He was perhaps 55, thin-shouldered with the same dark hair as his daughter but shot through with gray, and he walked with a slight limp that Aaron noticed when the congregation rose for the opening hymn. He had the careful bearing of a man who had once stood straighter and was managing the change with as much dignity as possible. The Reverend was a small, earnest man named Calloway who preached about patience in a way that suggested he was preaching as much to himself as to anyone else. Aaron paid attention to the sermon because he was a man who paid attention to things, and because it gave him something to do with his eyes other than look at the back of Irene Slater's head, which he was working very hard not to do. After the service, people gathered outside in the dry Kansas morning, talking and watching their children run. Aaron was standing by himself near the church steps when Irene's father caught his eye and walked over with the careful step of a man whose hip was not what it had been. You are one of Harlan's new men, the older man said. It was not a question. Yes, sir, Aaron Fletcher. James Slater. He extended a hand and Aaron shook it. Man had a good grip still. My daughter mentioned someone had helped her out of an unpleasant situation last week. Aaron glanced toward where Irene was talking with 2 women near the church door. It was nothing that needed doing. It needed doing, James Slater said without ceremony. He studied Aaron with the same direct gaze that Aaron was beginning to recognize as a Slater family characteristic. Where are you from, Fletcher? Ohio, originally. Been out west about 5 years now. Family. None to speak of. Parents passed some years back. No brothers or sisters. James nodded. He seemed to be doing arithmetic in his head. You a permanent man at Harlan's or moving on come fall? I have not decided, Aaron said honestly. James Slater looked at him for a moment longer. Then Irene arrived at her father's side, and whatever James had been about to say got swallowed back. I see you have met each other, she said, looking between them with the expression of a woman who is not surprised but is reserving judgment. Your father was asking me about my employment, Aaron said. Was he, she said, and there was a slight lift at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was something adjacent to one. It is a reasonable question, James said, unrepentantly. I am sure Mr. Fletcher is busy, Irene said, and she was looking at Aaron with those steady dark eyes, and Aaron discovered he was not busy at all. Actually, he said, I was going to see about coffee at Mrs. Hadley's before riding back. If you were going that direction, he stopped himself. He had not planned to say that. He was not certain where it had come from. There was a brief pause during which the Kansas sun beat down on all three of them with complete impartiality. We were, Irene said. And that was how Aaron Fletcher had his first cup of coffee with Irene Slater, at a round table in Mrs. Hadley's small dining room that smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, with James Slater at the same table reading the Caldwell Post with great concentration and saying nothing at all, which Aaron took for a kind of permission. Irene told him, over the course of that first hour, that she was 23 years old and had lived in Caldwell for 2 years. Before that, she and her father had been in Independence, Missouri, where her mother had died of consumption when Irene was 19. They had come west because her father had wanted a fresh start, and because there was farmable land to be had in Kansas at prices a man with modest savings could manage. The farm was 30 acres, mostly winter wheat, and they had made a reasonable go of it these 2 years, although the previous winter had been hard and the crop was slow. She told him this plainly, without self-pity or excess sentiment, the way a person describes weather. Aaron listened the way he always listened, completely, without filling the spaces with his own words. He asked her about the calico, which made her laugh, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was warm and real, and came from somewhere deep in her chest, rather than politely from the front of her mouth, where most women in his experience kept their laughs for mixed company. She asked him about Ohio. He told her about the farm his parents had kept near Dayton, about the summer he was 16 when a late frost killed most of the crop and his father had not said a single word of complaint, had simply walked out to the fields and begun replanting what could still be replanted. He told her about coming west at 21 because Ohio had started to feel like a room he had filled completely, and he needed more walls. She listened the way he listened, with her full attention, not waiting for him to stop so she could speak. When they parted that afternoon, Aaron back to the Harlan spread, Irene and her father back to their farm. Aaron was 3 miles down the road before he realized he had been smiling for some time without knowing it. After that, it became a rhythm. The weeks had a shape that they had not had before. Monday through Friday and half of Saturday, cattle, horses, fence, hay, the company of men. Saturday afternoon and Sunday, Caldwell, church, Mrs. Hadley's coffee. Sometimes, with James Slater's silent approval, a walk along the road east of town where the prairie opened up wide and gold, and the sky did everything it knew how to do. He learned her in pieces, the way you learn a landscape gradually, and with the understanding that each new thing revealed makes you want to see more. He learned that she read everything she could get her hands on, that she had read through the small collection at the Caldwell Lending Library twice, and had begun writing to a bookseller in Kansas City for titles by mail. He learned that she could do arithmetic faster than anyone he had ever met, that she did her father's farm accounts every Sunday evening, that she had once argued a bank clerk in Independence into reversing a fee that had been applied incorrectly to her father's account, and had done so entirely by citing the bank's own written policy, which she had read and memorized before the meeting. He learned that she was afraid of nothing in the ordinary sense, not hard work, not difficult men, not an empty pantry, not the Kansas winter, but that she was quietly, privately afraid of her father's hip, which had been getting worse, and what it would mean for the farm and for him when the winter wheat needed harvesting. He learned that she had a habit, when she was thinking about something she cared about, of pressing the tip of her index finger against her lower lip, barely touching it, as though she were marking a pause in a sentence. He learned that she was the most genuine person he had ever sat across a table from. For his part, he told her more than he had told anyone since his parents were alive. He told her about the years in Abilene and Dodge, and how the work had been good, but the loneliness of it had settled into him slowly, the way cold settles into a building. You do not notice it until one day you realize you have forgotten what warm felt like. He told her about a week in Wichita when he had been paid and had enough money in his pocket to do anything he wanted, and what he had wanted was to sit by the Arkansas River and read a newspaper cover to cover without anyone talking to him, and how that had made him feel both peaceful and melancholy in equal measure, and he was not sure what to make of that. She had looked at him with her index finger against her lower lip. "It means you were lonely," she said. "And you knew it, even if you called it something else." He had looked at her across the table in Mrs. Hadley's dining room, and something in his chest had shifted. "Yes," he said, "I think that is exactly what it means." In September, the first of the trouble came. It came in the form of a man named Cole Devereaux, who rode into Caldwell from the south with 4 men behind him, and a reputation that had come ahead of him by several weeks. Devereaux was a cattle buyer in theory, but the stories that had drifted up from the Texas Trail were not about cattle buying. They were about land, about methods, about a particular way of making a small landowner's position so uncomfortable that selling, at whatever price Devereaux offered, became the only reasonable option. Aaron first heard his name from Ernesto, who had a cousin who had worked a spread in the Texas Panhandle, where Devereaux had operated 2 years before. 3 men sold to him fast, Ernesto said. 2 tried to hold out. One of them had a fire in his barn. The other one, his cattle started disappearing, a few at a time. Maybe rustlers, maybe not. He sold before winter. "Harlan know about this?" Aaron asked. "Harlan knows about everything," Ernesto said. "He is not worried. He has been here 20 years. He has friends in this town." Aaron thought about James Slater's 30 acres on the north edge of Caldwell and said nothing to Ernesto. That Sunday, he told Irene what he had heard. They were walking the East Road, the late September sun coming at a low angle across the prairie, everything amber and gold. She listened without interrupting. "There have been men coming to the North Farms," she said when he had finished. "My father told me a man came by last week while I was in town, friendly, offered to buy the place at what my father said was about half of what it is worth." "What did your father say?" "That he was not selling." She paused. "The man said he hoped my father would think about it. My father said he had thought about it during the conversation and his answer was no, and could the man please see himself off the property?" Aaron felt something sharp and protective move through him. He kept his voice level. "That would have been Devereaux's man." "I expect so." She was quiet for a moment, pressing her finger against her lip. "We are not selling, Aaron. This is the first thing that has been ours in a long time. My father put everything he had left into those 30 acres. "I know," he said. And then, before he could think about it, he said, "I am not going to let anything happen to it." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The prairie wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves, and somewhere behind them, a meadowlark was insisting on something from a fence post. She looked at him in that complete, measuring way she had. Not testing him, just looking at him the way a person looks when they are deciding whether something is real. "Aaron," she said quietly. "I mean it," he said. "I know I do not have a great deal to offer by way of resources, but I have time and I have—" He stopped himself. This was not the moment. He knew it was not the moment. He looked at her and made himself finish the sentence a different way. I have attention to give to this problem if you will let me." She held his gaze for a long breath, then she nodded. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They walked back toward town in the cooling evening, their shoulders occasionally close enough to touch, neither of them moving away when that happened. Over the following weeks, Aaron kept his ears open. He was well positioned for it. The Harlan spread was a gathering point for information from the trail hands who moved through Caldwell, and Ernesto had a network of acquaintance that seemed to extend to every ranch hand between Kansas and the Mexican border. What Aaron pieced together was this. Devereaux was interested in the North Farms not for farming, but for a railroad spur that someone. Nobody was being specific about who was planning to run through the area, and the right-of-way would need to be bought or taken, and Devereaux had found it more profitable in the past to acquire land cheaply and sell the right-of-way expensively. He brought this to James Slater on a Sunday afternoon in October while Irene was in the kitchen. James was sitting at his kitchen table with his accounts, his bad hip stretched out under the table, and he listened to Aaron with his hands folded and his eyes on the middle distance. "I have heard similar," James said when Aaron finished. "There has been talk of a rail line south from Wichita since last year. I did not connect it to this." "I think you should," Aaron said. "And I think there may be legal recourse. The right-of-way would have to be properly adjudicated. If the small landowners along the proposed route organized together, presented their case to the county land office." James was looking at him with a small expression of reassessment. "You know land law, Fletcher?" "Not formally, but I spent 2 winters in Wichita with not much to do and a good lending library. I read what interested me." James was quiet for a moment, then he almost smiled. "My daughter said you were the most self-educated man she had met since her mother," he said. "I thought she was being generous." Aaron felt warmth in his face. He did not look away. "She is generous by nature. But I think on this particular point she might not be wrong." James nodded slowly. "I will talk to Brickley and the Martins. They have farms on the North Road as well. If we are going to do something about this, it wants doing soon, before Devereaux decides patience is no longer his best tool." Aaron nodded. He started to stand. "Fletcher," James said. He sat back down. James Slater looked at him with the same direct dark gaze as his daughter and said, very simply, "What are your intentions toward Irene?" Aaron did not flinch. He had thought about this question for weeks, had rolled it around in him on every long ride back from Caldwell, on every early morning when he was up before the others, and standing outside the bunkhouse with his coffee, watching the Kansas sky go from black to gray to that particular burning pink it achieved in October. "Honest ones," he said, "fully honest, but I am aware that at present I have very little to offer beyond that. I want to change that before I say anything more to her." James studied him for a long time. "I appreciate the honesty," he said at last, "and I appreciate the work you have done on this Devereaux business. A man who looks after what matters to the people he cares about, that is worth more to me than money or property." He paused. "But I will tell you this, Fletcher, because it is true and because she will not tell you herself. My daughter does not give her attention lightly. She has not since her mother died. She is careful with herself. If you have been receiving her attention these past months, it means something." Aaron nodded. He felt the weight of it, and it did not feel like a burden. It felt like something worth carrying carefully. "I understand," he said. He rode back to the Harlan spread in the October dark with the stars very bright above him and Rosie's breath misting in the cooling air, and he thought about what he wanted, which was no longer a question with a vague or complicated answer. He wanted Irene Slater and a piece of land and a life built from honest work, and he wanted it with a clarity that surprised him, that felt like waking up after a long sleep and finding the world sharper and more present than he remembered it. The situation with Devereaux moved faster than Aaron had anticipated. In the second week of October, James Slater organized a meeting at his farm with the Brickleys and the Martin family, Frank Martin, his wife Clara, and their son Thomas, who ran the north end of their spread. Aaron was there as the person who had done most of the research, and he laid out what he knew about the proposed rail spur, the right-of-way requirements under Kansas territorial law, and the importance of filing documentation with the county land office before Devereaux could move to have any informal agreements recognized. The Martins and the Brickleys were skeptical at first. Farmers who had worked their land through hard seasons had a deep practical skepticism about legal processes, and with reason, because in Aaron's experience the law was a tool that worked better for people who could afford its use. But the point he kept making was simple. The land office documentation was cheap to file. A collective objection cost nothing but time and a trip to the county seat. And if the rail company needed the right-of-way, they would have to negotiate properly if the landowners were on record as organized and informed. Frank Martin, who was 50 and had the burned face and slow speech of a man who had spent 30 years making decisions in fields, said at the end of Aaron's explanation, "And you are doing this why, Fletcher? You do not own land here." Aaron looked at the man. "I care about the people who do," he said simply. Frank Martin looked at James Slater. James Slater said nothing, but something in his expression confirmed something for Frank, who nodded and said, "All right, we go to the county seat." They went the following week, 5 of them in 2 wagons, Aaron and James Slater in one, the Martins and Brickleys in the other. The county seat was 18 miles east, a day's ride there and back. The land office clerk was a small, precise man who clearly had more respect for paperwork than he did for people, which in this particular context worked in their favor. Aaron presented the documentation, a formal collective statement of the landowners' existing titles, their knowledge of the proposed rail spur, and their intention to be party to any right-of-way proceedings. And the clerk registered it with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that he was being watched and would be held to account. They rode back in the late afternoon, James Slater saying almost nothing for the first hour, and then, as the Caldwell church steeple came into view on the horizon, he said quietly, "You did a good thing today, Fletcher." "We all did," Aaron said. James shook his head slightly. "You made it possible. There is a difference." Devereaux did not give up immediately. He was not that kind of man. But when he came to the Slater farm a second time, in early November, with a slightly different offer and a slightly more aggressive representative, James Slater was able to say, with complete accuracy, that the matter was now part of a formal county land office proceeding, and that any pressure applied to any party to that proceeding would be documented and presented to the county sheriff, who was a man named Morrison and who happened to have been at school with Frank Martin, and was consequently not unsympathetic to the farmers of the North Road. Devereaux's man left without the same pleasantness with which he had arrived. Devereaux himself left Caldwell 3 weeks later. Word came back that he had moved his operations to a county in the western part of the state where the organizational infrastructure was, apparently, less prepared for him. Aaron heard this news on a Saturday from Ernesto, who had heard it from one of his trail hand network, and he rode into Caldwell that afternoon with something very light in his chest. He found Irene at Mrs. Hadley's, which was where she often was on Saturday afternoons, talking with Mrs. Hadley herself about the boarding house accounts, because Irene had a gift for numbers and Mrs. Hadley had a gift for cooking, and neither of them could do the other's gift, which had turned into a mutually beneficial arrangement. When he came through the door, she looked up at him and read something in his face immediately. "It is over," she said, not quite a question. "He has left the county," Aaron said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she came across the room to him and she took his hand in both of hers and held it and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "Aaron, thank you." He looked down at their joined hands. Her hands were strong and warm, calloused at the fingertips from farm work, and they held his with complete simplicity, without calculation or performance. "It was the right thing to do," he said. "You did more than the right thing," she said. "You did the whole thing. My father knows it, I know it." He felt something build in him and he pushed it back carefully. Not yet. Not this moment, but soon. November in Kansas was honest about its intentions. The cold came in from the north without apology, and the sky went low and gray and close, and the prairie grass turned the color of dry bones. The cattle work at the Harlan spread shifted to winter preparation, mending shelters, laying in hay, checking the fences against the weight of ice that would come with January. Aaron had talked to Douglas Harlan at the end of October and asked about the possibility of a permanent arrangement. Not just seasonal work, but a full-year position with the prospect of some small share arrangement in the spring season. Harlan had listened and been quiet for a long time in the way that Harlan was always quiet, and then he had said that he had been watching Aaron since August, and he thought he was the kind of man a ranch needed, and he would talk to his lawyer about the share arrangement, which Aaron took as a yes. By mid-November, Aaron had enough in wages and the beginnings of a share arrangement that he could say with reasonable confidence he was not going anywhere. He had roots beginning in this ground, even if they were young and still shallow. On a cold Saturday in late November, he rode into Caldwell in his single blue work shirt and the winter coat he had bought secondhand from the dry goods store for $2, and he stopped at Mrs. Hadley's and discovered that Irene was not there. Mrs. Hadley, who had by this point developed opinions about Aaron Fletcher that she kept almost entirely to herself, told him Irene had gone to the lending library. He went to the lending library, which was in the back room of the newspaper office, because that was the only space the town had agreed to give it. The librarian, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Drummond, was asleep in her chair near the stove. Irene was standing at the shelf, her back to the door, running her finger along the spines of the books with the expression of a person conducting a negotiation with a limited inventory. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, and everything he had been carrying these past months sorted itself into its proper order. He took a step into the room and she heard the floorboard and turned around, and when she saw him something warm and unguarded moved across her face before she put the quieter version of it in place. "I knew you would be here," he said. "I am very predictable," she agreed, turning back to the shelf. "Mrs. Drummond has acquired 2 new titles from Kansas City and I cannot decide between them." "Take both," he said. "You will finish the first one before Christmas and you will have something to read over the new year." She looked at him over her shoulder. "That is a very reasonable suggestion." "I have my moments," he said. He came and stood beside her at the shelf, close enough that their arms were almost touching. She did not move away. "Irene," he said. She turned. They were very close in the narrow space between the shelf and the wall. Mrs. Drummond continued to sleep. "I have been thinking about something," he said, "for a while now." Her expression was very still and very attentive. "I do not have a great deal," he said. "I have a horse and a shirt and a share arrangement with Harlan that is going to take time to amount to anything. I have no house of my own yet, no land, no savings to speak of. I am aware of all of that." "Aaron, let me finish," he said. "Please. I have been working up to this for 3 months, and if you stop me, I am not sure I can start again." She was quiet. Her eyes were very bright. "I have been looking for something since I was 21 years old," he said. "Not a place, exactly, and not money. Something I could not have named until I found it. And I found it in Caldwell, Kansas, in August of 1878, in a general store on a Tuesday, when you told a man behind a counter that you had been given his word, and his word should mean something." She had gone very still. "You are the most genuine person I have ever known," he said. "You are steady and brave and kind, and you read everything you can find, and you do arithmetic faster than anyone, and you are not afraid of anything except things that are worth being afraid of. And I love you, Irene. I love you completely and honestly, and I would like very much, when I am in a position to offer you something worthy of you, to ask you—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "I have not finished asking." "Yes," she said again. Her voice was low and very steady, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was close to them. "Aaron, whatever you are going to ask, yes." He looked at her for a moment, this woman who argued for fair prices and organized against injustice and read every book she could find, and held his hand with both of hers like it was something worth keeping. "You did not let me finish," he said. "You were taking a very long time," she said, and she was smiling now, the full, bright, warm smile that did what it always did to the room and to him. He laughed. He could not help it. It came up from somewhere deep and genuine, and then she was laughing too, and Mrs. Drummond made a small sound in her sleep and shifted in her chair, and they both went very quiet and then looked at each other, and the laughing started again, quieter this time, the kind of laughing that two people do when they are the only ones in on the thing that is funny. When it settled, he took her hand the way she had taken his in both of his, with the same simple completeness. "I was going to ask if you would marry me," he said. "I know," she said. "And yes, Aaron, yes." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it. And then they stood together in the narrow library space with the winter outside the frosted windows and Mrs. Drummond asleep, and the stove ticking, and the feeling between them of something that had been building since August arriving, fully and finally, at its destination. James Slater's response to the news, delivered that same evening at the farm, was to shake Aaron's hand with both of his and then to sit down at the kitchen table and be quiet for a long time and then to say, "Your mother would have liked him, Irene. I think that very sincerely." Irene, who was sitting across from her father, reached across the table and took his hand, and James looked at his daughter and then at Aaron and then out the window at the Kansas night, and he nodded once, with his whole self. They were married on the 15th of February, 1879, in the Caldwell Methodist Church, which leaned slightly to the left and was filled with cold February light that came through the two clear glass windows and lay across the wooden pews in long pale stripes. Reverend Calloway officiated with an emotion that Aaron suspected had more to do with the general scarcity of weddings in February than any particular attachment. But the words were true words, and they said them clearly. Irene wore a dress she had made herself from the calico she had bought at 22 cents a yard from Mr. Tibbs, who had the grace to attend the wedding and to press Irene's hand warmly afterward, and say she was a credit to the town, which she received with characteristic directness. "Thank you, Mr. Tibbs. The dress did turn out well." The congregation included Douglas Harlan, who had driven in from the spread in his good coat, and sat in the back row looking uncomfortable with sentiment, but present nonetheless. It included Ernesto, who wept openly and made no apology for it. It included Cal and Pete Dunmore, who had polished their boots for the occasion and argued cheerfully on the way to church about whether the shine on Cal's left boot was better than Pete's right or vice versa. It included Sam Whitehorse, who had once given Aaron a simple piece of advice about reading a horse's breathing that had prevented a serious injury, and who sat quietly near the middle of the church and nodded when Aaron caught his eye. It included Billy Fields, who wore his only good shirt and looked very young and very hopeful. It included Mrs. Hadley, who had made a wedding cake from scratch the previous day and refused to discuss the effort it had cost her. It included Mrs. Drummond from the lending library. It included the Martins and the Brickleys, Frank Martin shaking Aaron's hand afterward with the conviction of a man who has adjusted his opinion of someone and finds the adjustment satisfactory. It included James Slater, standing at the front of the church with his daughter on his arm, his limp a little worse in the cold, his face arranged into the careful dignity of a man doing his best to contain a very large and not entirely comfortable amount of feeling. When Reverend Calloway said the words, and when Aaron and Irene said the words back, and when Aaron took Irene's hand and looked at her in the cold February light of the church that leaned slightly to the left, she looked back at him in the complete and unguarded way she had showed him more and more freely as the months had passed. And what he saw there was exactly what he had seen that first day in the general store, and had spent 6 months learning the full extent of something genuine all the way through, with nothing hidden and nothing withheld. He kissed his wife in the Caldwell Methodist Church while the congregation clapped and Ernesto cried, and the February wind outside did what it always did, which was everything it wanted, and it did not matter at all. They began their married life in a rented room at Mrs. Hadley's, because Aaron's wages, even with the share arrangement taking shape, did not yet stretch to a house of their own. Mrs. Hadley, who had charged everyone else 40 cents a night for her rooms, charged Aaron and Irene 30 cents, and never said a word about it except to wave off any mention of it with the flat of her hand. The room was small and had one window that faced east, which Irene said was perfect because she liked the morning light. Aaron built a small shelf above the window for her books. Within a month she had filled it. They fell into a life that was plain and real and theirs. Aaron rode out to the Harlan spread 6 days a week, and on Sundays they went to church and then spent the afternoon at James Slater's farm, where Aaron had begun working on the hip problem from a practical angle, not medicine, which was not something he could offer, but labor. He had rebuilt the section of fence that James had been struggling with for a year. He had reorganized the hay storage so it was accessible without the kind of bending that made James's hip protest most. He had arranged, through Harlan, for Ernesto to come by twice a month with his extraordinary knowledge of horses to look at the 2 draft animals James used for the heavy farm work, because well-maintained horses meant less physical work for the man directing them. James accepted all of this without excessive comment, which Aaron had come to understand was the highest form of gratitude available from that particular man. Irene, for her part, had continued her arrangement with Mrs. Hadley and had taken on the bookkeeping for the dry goods store, not for Mr. Tibbs, whose books, she informed Aaron one evening, were in a condition that suggested they had never been organized at all, but for a new general merchandise trader who had set up on the south end of town in March. She was paid $3 a month for this, which she saved with the focused intention of a person who knows exactly what the money is for. Land, she told Aaron one evening in April when he asked what she was saving toward. Not much, not yet, but a piece of it. Something we can say is ours. He looked at her across the small table in their room at Mrs. Hadley's, the spring evening coming through the east window, the last of the sun turning everything gold. I have been thinking the same thing, he said. Harlan has been talking about some parcels on the west edge of his property. Not farm land, mostly grazing, but there is a creek running through it and the shelter of the ridge above it. He is not using it and he might be willing to sell on a long payment arrangement. Irene was very still in the way she was when she was doing arithmetic in her head. How many acres? Maybe 60. He has not named a price yet. She pressed her finger to her lower lip. He watched her think. He never got tired of watching her think. Talk to him, she said. He talked to Harlan the next morning. Harlan was quiet for a long time in the way of a man who is deciding how much to be direct about something. Then he said, Fletcher, I'm going to tell you something and I want you to listen to it the same way you listen to everything, which is without jumping to the wrong conclusion. All right, Aaron said. I have been thinking about the future of this spread, Harlan said. I have no children. I have a good operation and good men, and I am 60 years old with nobody to leave any of it to. He paused. I have been watching you for 9 months. You are the best man I have had on this land since Sam, and Sam is not interested in ownership, which I respect. You are interested. I can see it every day. Aaron said nothing. I am not talking about giving you anything, Harlan said. I do not believe in giving what should be earned. But there is a fair arrangement to be made here over time if you are committed to staying. A full partnership arrangement, not just the share we discussed. A real part of this spread built over years. Aaron felt something very large and very quiet settle into him. I am committed to staying, he said. Harlan nodded. Then we talk numbers next week. The 60 acres you mentioned that can be part of the arrangement. A house plot. Your own land, properly titled, carved from the parcel west of the creek. The rest we work out as a long partnership. He extended his hand. Aaron shook it. He rode back to Caldwell that evening in the full spring gold of a Kansas afternoon, Rosie moving easy under him, the whole country smelling of new grass and creek water, and he thought about what a man's life could become if it came to the right place at the right time, and if he was paying enough attention to know it when he arrived. He told Irene that evening. He told her all of it, sitting at their table with the east window full of evening sky. She listened without interrupting, which she always did, and when he finished she sat for a moment with her hands folded on the table, and then she said, "Are you certain about this? Staying, committing to this place and this man's operation for years?" "I am certain about everything that is here," he said. "About you, about your father's farm north of town, about these people and this ground. I am more certain than I have been of anything since I came west." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Then I am certain too," she said. They sat together in the evening light, and outside the window the Kansas spring did everything it knew how to do, which was to be overwhelming and beautiful and completely honest about all of it. In May, Irene told him she was expecting. She told him the way she told him most important things, simply, directly, while doing something else, so that the weight of it was presented plainly without ceremony. They were walking back from her father's farm on a Sunday afternoon, the prairie all high grass and wildflowers, the sky an enormous uninterrupted blue above them. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. "Sometime in late autumn, I think." Aaron stopped walking. She kept going 2 more steps and then turned to look at him. He was standing in the middle of the road, and whatever his face was doing, it made her smile. "Aaron," she said. He went to her in 2 steps and took both her hands. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. "Is that?" She was watching him carefully. "Irene," he said, "that is the best thing you have ever said to me, and you have said a great many extraordinary things." She laughed, the real warm laugh that came from the deep part of her chest, and he held both her hands in his, and the Kansas afternoon surrounded them, and neither of them spoke for a moment, because sometimes the right response to a thing is simply to stand in it. The next months were the fullest of Aaron Fletcher's life. He worked the Harlan spread with the focused energy of a man building something, which is the most productive energy there is. He and Harlan had formalized their arrangement in June, a written document, witnessed by the county clerk, establishing Aaron as a junior partner in the Harlan operation with a defined path to 30% ownership over 8 years. The 60-acre parcel west of the creek was separately titled in Aaron's and Irene's names, with a payment arrangement spread over 10 years that they could manage on their combined income. He began building the house in June. He did not build it alone. Sam Whitehorse, who had skills Aaron had not known about, and who turned out to have built 3 structures on the Harlan property over the years, taught him the frame method on the first 2 weekends, and then the rest went up steadily through the summer. Ernesto came on Saturdays with opinions about the porch orientation that were always argued and frequently correct. Cal and Pete Dunmore came twice, and were extremely useful in the way that large, cheerful, uncomplicated men often are when what is needed is physical labor applied with goodwill. James Slater came out once in late July, and stood looking at the house frame with his hands in his pockets and the summer sun on his face, and Aaron saw something in the older man's expression that was private and deep and grateful, and he did not comment on it. Irene came on Sunday afternoons and walked through the frame with complete attention, noting where windows should go and how the kitchen would lie relative to the morning sun, and her eye for proportion was, as Aaron was not surprised to discover, precise and excellent. "The window there wants to be bigger," she said one afternoon, pointing to the east wall of what would be the main room. "I can do that," Aaron said. He did it. "And I think the porch should run the full length of the south side," she said, "not just the front half." "That is more lumber," he said. "I know," she said, with the expression of a woman who has done the arithmetic and considers the result worthwhile. He built the full-length porch. The house was not grand. It was solid and plain and honest. The way the people who built it were solid and plain and honest, with a full porch and good windows and a kitchen that faced east so the morning light came in while coffee was made. There was a main room, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a small room at the back that Irene designated as the library, which made Aaron love her even more than he already did, which he had not been sure was possible. They moved in on the 1st of September, 1879, carrying their things from Mrs. Hadley's rooming house in 2 trips on the wagon. Mrs. Hadley stood on her porch and watched them go and did not cry, but she did blow her nose twice with a decisiveness that suggested she was holding something firm. Irene walked through the house on that first afternoon, touching the walls and the window frames and the new bookshelves Aaron had built in the library room, and she did it with the expression of someone confirming that something is real. "Is it what you wanted?" Aaron asked, watching her from the doorway. She turned to him with the full, bright smile. "It is more," she said. Their son was born on the 23rd of November, 1879, in the bedroom of the new house, attended by the doctor who came out from Caldwell and by Irene's iron-jawed determination, which was, Aaron reflected, probably more effective than the doctor in any case. He held his wife's hand for 7 hours, and she squeezed his hard enough that 2 of his fingers went numb, and she did not make one complaint the entire time except to say at one point, "This is taking considerably longer than I calculated," which made the doctor laugh and made Aaron press his face against her hair and say, "You are extraordinary," which she absorbed without comment because she was busy. The boy was born at 4:30 in the morning, red-faced and loudly opinionated from the first breath. "He is perfect," Aaron said. His voice was not entirely steady. Irene was holding the child against her chest, and her face was the most open he had ever seen it, completely unguarded, lit from within. "He looks like you," she said, looking up at him. "The eyes. The stubborn expression is yours," Aaron said. She laughed, exhausted and radiant. "He is 30 minutes old, Aaron." "I know what I see," he said. They named him James William Fletcher James for his grandfather. William because Irene had liked the name since reading a particular novel, and Aaron thought it suited a person who would grow up in this house and on this land. James Slater came out to the house the next morning and held his grandson for 20 minutes in complete silence and then said, "Thank you, both of you," which was the longest emotional statement Aaron had ever heard from the man and which Irene received by taking her father's hand and holding it, which was enough. The baby was healthy and loud and absolutely certain about his needs at all hours, and Aaron and Irene navigated this together with the same easy partnership they brought to everything. Not without difficulty, not without exhaustion, but without resentment, and without losing the thread of each other that they had found in the summer of 1878. Sam Whitehorse came by the house on a Sunday in December with a carved wooden rattle for the baby, made from cottonwood, smooth and well-made. He handed it to Irene and said, "For the boy. Good wood. Solid." Irene thanked him with complete genuineness, and Sam nodded once and rode away. The following year was 1880, and it brought the full weight of the Kansas winter, and then a wet spring, and then a summer that was everything a farmer could want. And the Harlan spread moved cattle north through the season, and Aaron rode his share of the drive, though he was home by August and spent the late summer working the house property, planning the small kitchen garden Irene wanted for the following year, building a proper corral for Rosie, who was getting older but showed no intention of slowing down. Ernesto retired from the trail drives that year. He had been doing it since before the Kishome Trail had its current name, and he was somewhere north of 60, and he had decided that the prairie was beautiful enough from a porch. He built himself a small house on the edge of Caldwell, on a lot he had bought for himself with the wages of 20-some years of cattle work. And on Sundays, he came to the Fletcher's house for dinner and spent 2 hours with James Fletcher in the kitchen garden, teaching the 14-month-old boy about the proper respect owed to horses, which the boy received with the wide-eyed attention of someone who has found their subject. It was Ernesto who first noticed, in the early spring of 1881, that James Slater's hip had gotten bad enough that the farm work was genuinely beyond him. He came to Aaron after a Sunday visit to the farm with his assessment delivered with the directness of a man who has no patience for roundabout. "He cannot do it alone anymore," Ernesto said. "The spring planting he is trying, but he cannot manage the heavy work without paying someone, and he will not say so to Irene because he does not want to worry her." Aaron and Irene talked about it that evening, after James William was asleep. It was a spring evening and they were sitting on the full-length south porch, the darkness beyond the porch rail full of the sound of peepers and the smell of new grass, Irene's head against Aaron's shoulder in the easy way it had settled there over 2 years of marriage. "He will not come here," she said. "He is too stubborn and too proud." "I know," Aaron said. "But what if we went to him?" She lifted her head to look at him. "What do you mean?" "The farm needs management," he said. "It needs someone who can do the physical work that he cannot do right now. What if we folded the farm into our operation? Not take it from him, but properly integrate it. The wheat yields from his 30 acres are good. Combined with the share arrangement with Harlan, we could manage both properties if we hired one good hand." She was quiet with her thinking face on, finger touching her lip. "He would never accept charity. It is not charity the farm produces. A proper integrated arrangement produces more with less strain on everyone." He paused. "And it would let us keep him closer. Let us keep an eye on him." Another pause. The peepers went on insisting on whatever it was they were insisting on. "He would have to agree," she said. "Genuinely agree, not just accept because he has no other option." "You should be the one to propose it," Aaron said. "He will listen to you." She turned her head to look at him in the dark. "You have thought all of this through," she said. "I have had a while," he admitted, "since Ernesto told me." She was quiet for another moment, then she leaned back against his shoulder. "You see things before I do sometimes," she said. "I am not used to that." "You are better at numbers," he said. She laughed softly, and he held her on their porch with the spring night around them and the house solid and good at their backs. And he thought that if he had been asked at 21 what a life could become if it went right, he would not have been able to imagine this particular answer, and it was better than anything he would have imagined. James Slater agreed, after a conversation with Irene that took the better part of a Sunday afternoon and apparently covered every possible angle. He was to remain on the farm, which would be managed as part of the Fletcher operation, with a hired hand coming in 4 days a week for the heavy work. James was not to be idle. He managed the accounts for both properties, a task he performed with great care and visible satisfaction. Aaron drove out to the farm twice a week, and James drove into the Fletcher's house for Sunday dinner every week, and this was their arrangement, and it worked. The hired hand they found was a young man named Robert Hayes, 19 years old, recently arrived from Missouri with good references and the kind of steady disposition that made James Slater say, after 2 weeks, "He will do," which was high praise in that vocabulary. In the summer of 1881, a correspondent from a Kansas City newspaper came through Caldwell writing about the changes the cattle trade had brought to the southern Kansas towns, and he interviewed Douglas Harlan, among others, and Harlan mentioned his partnership arrangement with Aaron Fletcher, and the article included a paragraph about a young man from Ohio who had come west with nothing but a horse and the willingness to work, and had built something solid in southern Kansas. Irene read the article to Aaron at the breakfast table while James William ate his porridge with concentration, occasionally saying horse, because that was one of his current words, and he felt it was relevant to most conversations. "It says you are a model of Western enterprise," Irene said, with a slight lift at the corner of her mouth. "Embarrassing," Aaron said. "It also says you are, quote, a man of considerable personal integrity who has earned the respect of his community." She looked up from the paper. "I think it is accurate." He looked at her across the table in their kitchen in the morning light that came through the east window, his wife and his son, and the sound of the Kansas morning coming through the open door, and he said, "I have a great deal to be grateful for." She put down the paper and looked at him with the complete unguarded warmth that she gave him now freely, without reservation, the way she had come to give him everything. "So do I," she said. James William, apparently sensing that the general mood was positive, said "horse" again and then threw a piece of porridge which landed with some precision on Aaron's sleeve. And the moment dissolved into the ordinary wonderful chaos of morning with a 2-year-old. And it was, Aaron thought, exactly right. The spring of 1882 brought news through Caldwell that the railroad lines were extending further south, and the right-of-way question that had once threatened the North Farms came up again, this time through proper channels, with fair compensation offered to the landowners whose land lay in the route. The organized documentation that Aaron and James had filed with the County Land Office in 1878 turned out to be exactly what was needed. The landowners were on record as an organized group. Their collective representation was recognized by the rail company's legal team, and the negotiations that followed were between equals rather than between a corporation and isolated individuals. Frank Martin came by the Fletcher house in April to tell them the outcome. The rail company had agreed to compensation at full assessed land value for any land taken, plus a corridor fee for any land the line crossed but did not take. The North Road farms were not destroyed. They were, if anything, more secure. The rail line would run a mile east of the North Farm's eastern boundary, close enough to increase the value of the area without taking a single acre. Frank Martin shook Aaron's hand at the door and said, "That filing in '78, that was the thing, you know that." "Your willingness to go and do it was the thing," Aaron said. Frank shook his head. "You made it happen, Fletcher. I will say it until I die, and I will not change my mind about it." He went away back down the road, and Irene stood beside Aaron in the doorway watching him go, and she took Aaron's arm with both her hands in the way she had first taken his hand in the library that November afternoon 4 years ago. "You have been a good thing for this place," she said quietly. "It has been a good thing for me," he said. She leaned her head against his arm. "Both," she said. "Definitely both." That summer, James William Fletcher turned 3 years old and celebrated by escaping through the corral fence twice, making friends with a particularly tolerant among Harlan's younger horses, and eating dirt on one occasion that Aaron witnessed and chose not to explain to Irene beyond saying, "He is 3," and leaving it there. In the autumn of 1882, Irene told Aaron she was expecting again. Again on a Sunday walk, again simply, again while doing something else, this time watching their son chase a grasshopper through the long grass beside the road, while the October gold lay across everything. "Another one," she said, with a tone that suggested she had already done the relevant arithmetic and found the results manageable. Aaron looked at her. "When?" "May, I think." She was watching James William, who had lost the grasshopper and was now reconsidering his strategy. "How do you feel about May?" "I feel very well about May," he said. She looked up at him with the quiet, private smile, the one that had grown richer and more certain over 4 years of knowing each other. "Good," she said. He put his arm around her in the autumn afternoon, and they stood together watching their son negotiate with a Kansas grasshopper. And the sky above them was the enormous unreserved blue that only October in Kansas quite achieves. And Aaron Fletcher, who had come to this place with one shirt and one horse and a quiet, unkillable hope, thought that the word full was inadequate for what his life had become. But it was the closest word available, and so he used it. And it was enough. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold and long and honest, as Kansas winters were. Aaron split wood and mended fences and spent the evenings in the main room with his wife and his son, the wood stove doing its good work. James William at some point in every evening ending up in someone's lap with a book, because Irene's children were going to know books from the start if she had anything to say about it, which she did. She read to James William every night stories from a collection that Mrs. Drummond at the lending library had set aside specifically for them, knowing, as everyone in Caldwell now knew, what the Fletcher household's priorities were. She read him the stories of the desert and the mountain and the sea, places far from the Kansas prairie, and the boy listened with round eyes and then went to sleep and probably dreamed of them. Aaron watched this every evening and never found it less remarkable. James Slater's hip, managed now with the support of the hired hand and the regular presence of his family, was no better but no worse, and he had settled into the careful management of it the way he had settled into everything in his life, with practicality and without self-pity. He came to Sunday dinners and was an increasingly active presence in James William's life, teaching the boy to count with stones from the creek bed, telling him stories about independence that made the boy laugh with the uninhibited full-body laugh of a 3-year-old. "He laughs like you," Aaron told Irene one Sunday evening after James Slater had gone home. "Everyone says he looks like you," she said. "He has got both of us," Aaron said, which seemed right. May came, and with it, as predicted, their second child. This one was born easier than the first. The doctor said so. Irene said absolutely nothing about it. Aaron held her hand for 5 hours instead of 7. The child arrived in the mid-morning of a May day with the South Prairie wind moving through the open bedroom window and the whole room full of spring light. It was a boy again. "Another one," Irene said, holding the infant with the same lit-from-within expression she had worn holding James William, the one that was entirely unguarded and entirely hers. "Hello," Aaron said to his new son, which was not brilliant as first words go but was completely sincere. They named him Daniel Thomas Fletcher Daniel because it was Aaron's father's name, Thomas because Irene had said it was a solid name, and she was correct. James Slater held his second grandson on the following Sunday and said, "I am a rich man," looking not at the child but at the room around him, his daughter and her husband and his first grandson and the new baby and the house full of books and Sunday cooking and the smell of coffee. "Yes," Irene said, "you are." Caldwell grew through the early 1880s, the way frontier towns grew that happened to be on the right roads in the right country. New businesses came in. The church got a new roof and stopped leaning. The lending library moved into its own small building, donated by a cattle merchant who had made enough money in the previous decade to start making civic gestures. Mrs. Drummond, who had run the library from her chair by the stove for 15 years, stayed on and ran it from a better chair by a better stove, and was no less prone to sleeping. Aaron's partnership with Harlan continued to deepen. By 1884, his share of the operation had grown to 20%, and the 60 acres west of the creek had been fully paid off, and were properly and clearly his, a fact he had read on the title document several times in the year it arrived, with the feeling a man gets when something he has been reaching for is finally in his hands. The ranch employed 8 hands by then, including Robert Hayes, who had graduated from the Slater farm work to full-time work on the spread when James hired a younger man. Sam Whitehorse was still there, still the most trusted man on the property, still saying less than anyone and meaning more by it. Ernesto came by on Sundays and told the Fletcher boys stories about the cattle trails of the 1860s, and they listened with the hungry attention of children who understand instinctively that they are hearing history being spoken alive. In the autumn of 1884, Douglas Harlan called Aaron into his office and said that he had been to see his doctor in Wichita, and the doctor had told him certain things about his heart that he was not going to repeat in detail, but that had clarified his thinking about the future of the spread. He was 66 years old. He was going to continue working for as long as he was able, but he wanted the future of the operation established clearly. He proposed to leave Aaron Fletcher the entirety of the Harlan spread in his will, in recognition of 6 years of partnership and work and a quality of commitment that, as Harlan put it without any visible sentimentality, I have never seen in a hired man and have rarely seen in a son. Aaron was quiet for a long time after this. "I do not know what to say," he said finally, which was true. "You do not need to say anything," Harlan said. "I will have my lawyer draw up the documents. You and your wife should look them over. She will find any errors before he does, I expect." This was accurate. Irene reviewed the documents with the focused attention she brought to all documents, and found 2 clerical errors that the lawyer corrected with the slightly stung expression of a professional whose work has been improved by a farmer's wife. That evening, after the boys were in bed and the house was quiet with the particular quiet of a full house at rest, Aaron sat on the full-length south porch with his coffee in the autumn night, and Irene came and sat beside him, and he told her what Harlan had said and what the documents meant. She was quiet for a while. The night was very clear, and the Kansas stars did what they always did, which was be overwhelming. "He trusts you with everything he built," she said. "Yes," Aaron said. "That does not happen to everyone," she said. "No," he said, "it does not. I am aware of that every day." She leaned against him, her head against his shoulder. "When you rode into Caldwell 6 years ago with Rosie and one shirt," she said, "what did you think you were looking for?" He considered this seriously because she always asked things seriously and they deserved serious consideration. "Something real," he said. "I did not know what shape it would take, but something that was genuinely mine, that I had earned, and that was true." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you find it?" He turned his head to look at her in the dark. This woman who had said yes before he had finished asking, who had held his hand in both of hers like it was worth keeping, who had read every book in the lending library twice, and organized the North Farm accounts and argued with Mr. Tibbs and raised 2 boys with the same clear-eyed steadiness with which she did everything, who was the most genuine person he had ever known, and who was his wife and his home. "Yes," he said. "Everything I could have hoped for, and a great deal I did not know to hope for." She made a soft sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but was somehow both, and she took his hand in the darkness and held it. They sat on the porch in the autumn night while the stars went about their work overhead, and the Kansas prairie stretched away in all directions, enormous and honest and full of everything that was still possible. Douglas Harlan lived 6 more years, which none of the doctors had predicted, and which Harlan himself seemed to regard as a personal victory over the medical profession. He continued to come to the ranch 3 days a week, then 2, then 1, then on occasions of particular importance. A new cattle season beginning, a difficult winter wrapping up, the day Sam Whitehorse finally retired and Harlan came out specifically to shake his hand and watch him go. Harlan died in the spring of 1890, quietly in his own house, which was how he had always done things, without fuss, without requesting acknowledgement. He left the spread to Aaron Fletcher as documented, and he left a brief handwritten note that Aaron found in the house a week later, tucked inside the ranch ledger, that said only, "You are the best investment I ever made, Fletcher. The land and the cattle are yours. Take care of them." Aaron kept the note in the ranch ledger for the rest of his life. James William Fletcher was 11 years old when Harlan died, and Daniel Thomas Fletcher was 8. They were, by this point, unmistakably their parents' children. James William had his father's stillness and his mother's precision. Daniel had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn persistence in the face of any obstacle. Both of them could ride before they were 5, and both of them read everything they could find, a habit that Irene had cultivated in them with the same patient, consistent intention she applied to everything she considered important. They knew the land the way children know land when it is truly theirs, not as something to be worked at, but as something to be understood, something with character and history and its own requirements that deserved respect. Aaron made sure of that. He walked every acre of the spread with his sons from the time they were old enough to walk it, telling them the practical and the historical in equal measure. "This creek," he said to James William once, when the boy was 8 and they were following its course in the summer afternoon, "is why we are here. The land without water is just ground. Water makes it living." James William, who was 8 and already given to the kind of questions that took a moment to answer, said, "Did you know that when you picked this place?" "Someone wiser than me pointed it out," Aaron said, thinking of Sam Whitehorse standing by the ridge 5 years ago and saying simply, quietly, "Good water, good shelter, build here." The Fletcher spread it had taken on the name by the mid-1880s, the Harlan name gently retiring as it was right that it should was known in Caldwell by 1890 as one of the solid operations in the county. Not the biggest, not the flashiest, but consistent and honest, which in the long run was worth more. Aaron Fletcher was known as a man whose word meant what it said, and whose accounts were accurate, and whose land was well managed. And these were the things that mattered in southern Kansas in 1890 as they had in 1878, and as they always would. Irene had, by this time, expanded her bookkeeping work to include 3 businesses in Caldwell, which she managed from the house 3 mornings a week, while the boys were at the school that had been properly established in town in 1883. She had also become, unofficially but unmistakably, a resource for the women of the North Road farms who needed help with documents, accounts, or any situation that required clear thinking and steady nerve. She did not advertise this, and she did not charge for it. She simply helped when she was asked, in the same plain, direct way she helped with everything. The injustice of it, the fact that a woman of her intelligence and ability could not have practiced bookkeeping formally or sought legal recourse professionally, or participated in the land office proceedings in her own right rather than through her father or husband. This was something Aaron was aware of and had named to her once directly because he believed in naming things directly. She had considered his naming of it and said, "Yes, it is unjust. I know it every day. What I have found is that within the limits available there is still a great deal of good work to be done." Then after a pause she had added, "The limits will change, not quickly, but they will change, and the work done within them now matters regardless." He had looked at her with all the admiration he had ever felt for any person in his life and said, "You are right," and she was. James Slater's hip deteriorated further in 1888, and the doctor in Caldwell told him plainly that he would need to stop farming in any physical sense if he wanted the rest of his life to involve anything beyond pain management. James received this information with the same straight-shouldered dignity with which he received everything, and he moved to the Fletcher house that autumn, into the room that had been the library, which Irene reorganized so that the bookshelves lined the hallway instead, which was, she pointed out with complete accuracy, more practical anyway. James Slater lived in the Fletcher house for 3 more years, and they were good years. He managed all of the spread's financial accounts, sitting at a proper desk Aaron built for him in the corner of the main room, and he was present at every Sunday dinner and every morning coffee, and he read to his grandsons at night when they were small with the gravity of a man who understands that stories told to children are stories that last a lifetime. He died in November of 1891, in his room in the Fletcher house, on a clear cold morning when the first snow of the season had fallen overnight, and the world outside his window was entirely white and still. He died with his daughter holding his hand, and his son-in-law sitting on the other side of the bed, and both his grandsons sleeping down the hall, and the house around him solid and good and full of people who loved him. Aaron and Irene buried him beside Nora Harlan in the Caldwell churchyard, because that was the only churchyard there was, and because James had been church-going all his life, and because it seemed right that the man who had looked at Aaron Fletcher across a kitchen table and asked about his intentions, and who had found the answer honest enough to accept, should rest in the same ground that Aaron had made his home. Irene stood at the graveside with the snow still on the ground and the February sky very cold and very clear, and she did not cry in public because she was her father's daughter, but Aaron held her hand and felt the small trembling in it that she was holding in, and he stood close against her so she could take whatever she needed from the solidity of him. That evening, when the boys were in bed and the house was quiet with a different quality of quiet than it had been for 3 years. Irene sat at the kitchen table with her father's account books open in front of her, not working, just looking at his handwriting on the pages, the careful, precise figures that were the last physical evidence of his daily presence. Aaron sat across from her and said nothing and simply stayed. After a while, she looked up at him. Her eyes were wet finally, the way water finds its way through whatever holds it back when enough time has passed. "He was a very good man," she said. "He was," Aaron said, "one of the best I have known." She looked back at the accounts. "He trusted you from the beginning, you know. He told me the first Sunday at Mrs. Hadley's. He said, 'That is a man who means what he says.'" Aaron felt the weight of that, clean and true. "I hope I have not disappointed him," he said. Irene looked up again, and this time she did not hold anything back. She simply let it be on her face, the grief and the love and the certainty all together. "You have been everything he hoped for," she said, "and I think you know that." He did know that. And he held it carefully with both hands, the way you hold the things that matter most. By 1895, the Fletcher spread ran 600 head and employed 12 hands and was recognized in the county land records as one of the most productive operations in the region. Aaron was 43 years old and sat in Douglas Harlan's old chair in the ranch office with the particular ease of a man who has sat in his own place long enough to know it properly. James William was 16 and worked the spread with the focused capability of someone who has been learning it his whole life. Daniel was 13 and had his mother's gift for numbers and was increasingly doing the ranch accounts with her supervision, a situation Irene managed with the same balanced expectation she applied to everything, high enough to challenge, low enough to allow for growth. Rosie, Aaron's chestnut mare, had been retired from trail work years ago and lived in the main corral of the spread in a condition of dignified leisure that she clearly felt was her due. Aaron rode her on Sundays gently for the pleasure of both of them, and she had become in some undefinable way the household's unofficial mascot, visited regularly by both boys and tolerated by the ranch dogs, with the resigned respect that very old animals tend to command from younger ones. He brushed her on a Sunday morning in the October of 1895, while the light came low and gold across the corral, and Irene was on the porch with her coffee, and Daniel was inside doing sums, and James, William, was out with the hands on the west pasture, and Aaron stood in the golden morning with his old horse and thought about the man who had ridden her into Caldwell 17 years ago with one shirt and an inarticulate hope. He thought about all that had happened between that August morning and this October morning, every year of it, every piece, the coffee at Mrs. Hadley's, the South Road walk, the November day in the library when he had said everything he had been carrying and she had said yes before he was done, the house they had built, the boys, James Slater's handshake, Douglas Harlan's note in the ledger, the land under his feet, properly and fully his, earned through years of work and partnership and honesty. Irene came across the yard with a second cup of coffee because she always knew when he had been standing quietly for a while, and she always brought him coffee when she did. She gave it to him and stood beside him looking at Rosie, who regarded them both with the tolerant wisdom of a very old horse. "She is doing well," Irene said. "She is," Aaron said. "Better than she has any right to be." Irene looked at him with the small private smile. "What were you thinking about?" He looked at the land around him, the house and the corral and the outbuildings and the wide Kansas sky over all of it. He looked at his wife standing beside him in the morning light, 40 years old and more beautiful to him than she had been when she was 23, not because youth was required for beauty, but because he knew her fully now, every corner of her, every piece of the person she was, and knowing someone fully is the most clarifying thing there is. "August of 1878, he said. "A Tuesday in a general store." She looked at him. Something very warm moved across her face. "Ancient history," she said. "Not to me," he said. She took his arm and leaned against his shoulder the way she had 10,000 times, and they stood together in the October morning while Rosie watched them with her dark, patient eyes, and the Kansas sky went about its enormous, unhurried work. "Aaron," she said. "Yes." "I would still have said yes before you finished asking," she said. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. And everything he had ever hoped for was there in her face, as it had been from the beginning, as clear and real and true as the land beneath his boots. "I know," he said. And he kissed her in the morning light, on the land that was theirs, with the old horse watching and the sons they had raised somewhere near and the life they had built together standing solid all around them. And it was everything, and it was enough, and it was real. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not with drama, but with the daily accumulation of a life well lived. James William Fletcher married a woman from the Brickley family in 1899, a strong-minded girl named Margaret who could argue agricultural prices with anyone and who, Irene told Aaron with quiet satisfaction after the first dinner they shared, reminded her a little of herself when she was young. Aaron, who had always believed Irene was incomparable, nevertheless saw what she meant. Daniel Fletcher went east to a college in Kansas City in 1897 to study accounting formally, and came back 2 years later with the credential and the same steady disposition he had always had, and took over the financial management of the spread entirely, with the thoroughness that was his mother's gift running in him clear as a current. The spread continued, and the house continued, and the land continued, and Aaron Fletcher, who had once owned one shirt and ridden one horse into a town looking for something he could not name, found that what he had found was so much larger and more specific and more real than anything he had imagined looking for that the looking itself seemed, in retrospect, like a very small beginning for a very large thing. He was sitting on the full-length south porch on an evening in the spring of 1900, the 22nd year of his life in Caldwell, Kansas, watching the sun do what it did across the flat country, spread out and slow and completely without restraint, when Irene came and sat beside him and handed him his coffee and said, in the tone she used for things she had been thinking about for a while, "Margaret is expecting." He turned to her. James William's Margaret, the very same. She was smiling with the warmth she always kept for the things she loved most. A grandchild. He let the word move through him. He was 48 years old, and his son was going to be a father, and he was going to be a grandfather, and the land under his feet was going to be under a new generation's feet in due time. He felt the continuity of it not as an abstraction but as something physical, something like the feeling of a well-built house around you, solid and present. "Are they?" he began. "They are very happy," Irene said. "I have spoken to Margaret. She is well." He nodded. He looked out at the prairie evening. He thought about James William, who had his mother's precision and his father's stillness, who would be a good father by any measure Aaron could think of. "We have done well," he said quietly, meaning something larger than he could have said in more words. Irene put her hand over his on the porch arm. "We have," she said, "together. We have done very well." The grandchild was a boy, Robert James Fletcher, born in November of 1900. The name a nod to Robert Hayes, who had worked faithfully for the family for years, and who had, by this point, become something between an employee and a fixture. The kind of man a place accumulates over time and cannot quite imagine without. Aaron held his first grandchild in the kitchen of James William's house on the property, and felt the same awe he had felt holding James William and Daniel. The awe that children produce in people who understand what they represent, which is everything, forward, unwritten, full of every possibility there is. He rode Rosie home from the visit that evening in the November dusk, slowly because she was very old now and the ground was cold, and he talked to her the way he always had, quietly, not expecting answers but finding a clarity in the speaking of things that he had relied on for 22 years. "We made it, old girl," he told her. "Everything I was looking for. We found it. Right here." Rosie moved through the dusk with her steady old step taking him home. The lights of the Fletcher house were visible from the ridge, warm against the dark, and Irene was in the kitchen window briefly before moving away. He could see her silhouette, the shape of her, the specific and irreplaceable person she was. He rode down the last slope toward the house and the corral and the life they had built together. And the November stars were coming out above him one by one, and the Kansas night smelled of cold grass and distant wood smoke, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be in the world. He had come to this place with one shirt on his back and one horse beneath him and one question he was working up to ask. He had found something that had no adequate name, so he called it home, and he called it Irene, and he called it his life, and every one of those words meant the same thing, and all of it was true. Rosie came to the gate of the corral and stopped, patient as she had always been, waiting for him to dismount. He stepped down and led her in and removed her saddle and brushed her in the cold evening, and then he walked to the house and pushed open the door and went inside to his wife, to the warmth and the light and the sound of everything he had built. And he was home, and he had been home since August of 1878, and he would be home in this place, and with this woman for every year still left to him. And there was nothing more that a man who had come west with nothing and found everything could ask for beyond that, and so he did not ask. He had learned years ago that some things are better received than requested. Love was one of them. Home was another. He had ridden into Caldwell, Kansas on a summer day in 1878 with one shirt and one horse, and he had found the answer to a question he had been carrying for years, and the answer had said yes before he was done asking, and the rest was a life, full and honest and real, and it was everything.